Time passes so quickly. Yeah, there are so many scandals in Brazil, it seems like that one gets smaller. The case of Daniel Vorcaro, all signs indicate the biggest financial scandal in the country's history. Yeah, I know the question is easy. I assume the answer is complex. I don't know. Why did the whole Daniel Vorcaro world emerge? Why was there a scandal of this magnitude? And thank you for accepting our invitation.
The corruption scandals, when we see them lately, they've been going over 30, 40 billion, right? Yeah. They make it possible for figures like Daniel Vorcaro to emerge. When we look at it, and I think there's still a lot more to come out, right? You see that he managed to co-opt everyone in this big scheme he set up.
In such a short period of time, how was this possible? After all, some say, if I'm wrong, please correct me, there was Banco Matrix, I think, before him, right? And him, I don't know if it was around 2019 that he arrived in Sao Paulo, because after all, back in Minas, his family had already pulled a scam at the hotel. They were supposed to open in 2014, and people are still waiting for it to open, right? Yeah, so how was it possible in such a short period of time for someone, an adventurer, to just show up? He's a con artist and scammer, not a banker. Yet he quickly won over the hearts and minds of the Faria Lima crowd, like in classic 70s American movies. How did this happen so fast?
I have a very sociological point of view. It's very common for us to criticize Faria Lima like this. We created a society and financial capitalism with the neoliberal revolution that came and took over all the capitalist systems. And we, unfortunately, are maybe the ones who embrace the neoliberal playbook the most, right? And what we call Faria Lima is the heart of the financial system, of financial capitalism in Brazil. And the criticism I always make is that ever since we have had the objective, in the end, gold money is a means, not the end. Yeah, and financial capitalism prioritizes returns and profit. The more profit in a shorter time frame, the more money, the more accumulation. So people, they are guided by money. So it's very easy to co-opt this kind of people who are guided by money. And Daniel Vorcaro did nothing more than, take advantage of this greed from all branches of government, right? Involved, the legislative branch, the judiciary, the executive branch, and the very heart of Brazil's financial capitalism, Faria Lima itself. So that was it. He just set up the scheme. Obviously, we're still going to see a lot more come out, right? Faria Lima collaborated. The regulatory and oversight bodies at some point collaborated with this. The criticism you remember that I made in the Senate was exactly about that, right? That we have a capable civil service, technically well-trained, qualified, who identified this back in the past. And why at a certain point did this not go beyond the technical staff? Because the positions that really have authority at the CVM, at the central bank, are politically appointed positions, right? So you see that during Roberto Campos Neto's administration, there was some kind of complicity for this scheme to keep moving forward. This will still come out with evidence, right? Luiz Nassif even released a book now, the Banco Master Case, where he details exactly how this whole scheme was set up through funds, through the issuance of CDBs, through the co-opting of politicians, through the co-opting of technicians. No. Directors from the central bank, including 2 who were removed, were involved, all ultimately to make money. He co-opted everyone by offering money, right? Undue advantages to all branches of the republic and even to Faria Lima itself.
No one suspected anything when this guy showed up, right? With so much money, doing all these deals, offering 145% over there. The question I ask is, he said no, he said the company he was at, he still works there today. The brokerage firm stopped trading those securities. I don't know if it was in 2023 or 2024, who was doubting all of that. How do banks, I think brokerages too, for those watching us, it might even be good to explain, how are these securities traded and how did no one suspect values that were way above the market?
Anyone familiar with the market, even a bit, gets suspicious. I always say, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. As a financier, I've worked in the financial market for over 30 years and owned companies in the sector for the last 20. Yeah, people would come to me and say, this is wrong, man. At some point, this is going to go wrong, right? In fact, when there was a problem with Ampipar, I don't know if you remember, with the COIs there, when the market, Faria Lima, issued the Ampipar COIs, and there were investors who lost up to 97%. It was also a big scandal, but it kind of stayed restricted to the investment world. I took a look at those because the COE is the Structured Operation Certificate, right, from Ampipar. There were already signs of the fraud that later emerged since the Ampipar case involved Nelson Tanuri with 2 funds from Banco Master, right? Buying Ampipar shares, manipulating, and there were already 2 investigations at the CVM proving that they had manipulated the market to inflate Ampipar's stock price because they were going to give, Nelson Tanuri was going to give Ampipar's shares as collateral in the purchase of EMA here in Sao Paulo, the municipal water and energy company. He inflated the price just so he could use it as collateral, then emptied EMI's cash and didn't pay the debt. Right? The creditors of EMI who had the right to step in and take his company, took his company and handed it over to Sabesp. So there were already 2 CVM investigations into market manipulation to inflate Ampipa's price involving 2 Banco Master funds. So this had been happening for a while. Yeah, indications that Banco Master was using funds to commit fraud, to manipulate the market, and obviously the CDB had an air of illegality because it was guaranteed by the Credit Guarantee Fund. But major banks were already suspicious since they're the ones financing this. Yeah, for the most part, the Credit Guarantee Fund is funded through a percentage each institution has to pay, and the big banks make the largest contributions to it. So Banco Master was, I usually joke, in market slang, that they were using the Credit Guarantee Fund to put all these CDBs on the market. So the market itself knew, right, that this thing was going to go wrong. Now, why did they let it go so far and explode and turn into what it became? That's the big question that we still need to find out, right?
Yeah, that's a question for you, and certainly for those who are watching us, they're thinking about that too. Yeah. The bank, for example, Banco Master, needs to have an annual balance sheet that has to be approved, right, and audited. I keep thinking, and about previous events, not so long ago, Lojas Americanas, which is actually a recent issue, and today there was even news about it. How is it possible for an auditing company to let things slide so easily, or approve balance sheets, either because they are very well disguised, to put it in simpler terms, or is it normal?
Again, it's about the money, right, Professor? I always say money ends up blinding people. And the auditing company has a conflict of interest, right? The one who hires the auditing company to say if everything is right is the one who pays them, right? So all the big scandals we see, starting from the Enron case back then, WorldCom. During the subprime crisis, auditing firms and rating agencies were always involved in assessing company risk. But even in the movie, I think in that movie that portrayed the subprime crisis, The Big Short, there it shows the clashes and obstacles. The investor, Michael Burry, right, played by Christian Bale, he goes to the rating agencies and questions why they are giving that rating if he was seeing that the business was highly risky, right? So there's a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is about money. They're paid for that, right? So if you pay me to say whether you have risk or not, and if you pay me well, I'll say you don't have risk, right? The rating agencies and the auditing firms. And like you said, Warren Buffett himself, who is a living legend in investing, says that accounting is the language of business. You have to learn to look at the balance sheet. It's easy to see from the balance sheet that something is wrong. The Americanas case is a classic example. Someone looked at the balance sheet and noticed an issue. But Santander, the bank's largest creditor, later had a representative become president of Americanas. Are you saying the big bank didn't know? They knew, but kept profiting. As long as things kept moving, everyone made money. The issue comes when it stops.
So, how do you make money from this? Everyone who's watching us, everyone saw the news, then discussing toxic assets and so on. Nobody really knows what these assets are, let alone if they're toxic or supposed to be good. That's just assumed. But yeah, how is it possible with these assets? I even remember some people talking about the State Bank of Santa Catarina and so on, which is, I think if you take the paper and try to make a paper airplane, it won't fly, right?
It doesn't fly, right?
Which everyone knows. Now, how
So
did
it is
it
what
get
it
so
is, right?
toxic? How do you manage to turn these assets, which the market calls toxic assets, into something marketable that makes a profit, etc.? And, in more common language, it guarantees that this company will leverage this or that in its CDB, which is later bought. Let's take Rio Previdencia, for example, which buys a fabulous amount of that, as do other pension funds run by state governments or city halls. I mean, how is this done? I mean, how does an asset that's considered bad become something good, become something tangible, and the market or those people negotiating there say, no, this isn't bad, this is very good? How does this transition happen?
It's because in reality, human creativity has limits, especially when trying to pull off a scam, right? Even in the financial market, because there are financial instruments that are very complex, right? Remembering again the subprime credit, it was you took assets that were theoretically bad, just to give a quick summary, right? So the audience can understand. In the subprime credit, you sold houses to people who didn't even have an income. Many times they didn't even have a job. They were sold because the system allowed it. It's all about money. Sellers got commissions, so they sold. Those accepting contracts also got commissions, so they accepted. Then all this was bundled together in the securitization process. They combined it with better papers, making it seem like a good asset, but it actually had bad assets inside, right? So while this whole thing was running, Property values were going up, rents were being paid, everything was fine. But at some point, the pyramid collapses, the bubble bursts, right? And then those bad assets simply turn to dust because the person couldn't afford to pay even half of it if they weren't renting out the property. That's when everything flips. In the case of Banco Master and these funds as well, remembering that you rightly mentioned the shares of Banco Santa Catarina, in reality, those papers are already worthless. Not anymore. They shouldn't even exist, right? But someone had the brilliant idea and said, let's take this and put it in. Since it doesn't have a secondary market, it can't be marked to market, it has no liquidity. We hire a company to assess value, but they're paid by those who sent them. They're told what value to say it has. 100,000 reais for one of these shares, then they price it and put it in and say, now the fund holds shares from Banco de Santa Catarina and is valued at billions of reais, but they're actually worthless papers. Still, people were paid to set and accept the price, and the shares were added to the fund. Theoretically, there are some funds that have a confidentiality period for the manager. He doesn't have to say what strategy he's using, and then this thing just keeps going, yeah? And then people, like you mentioned, Rio Previdencia, okay? Then politicians get involved. The governor is getting something to ask the president of Rio Previdencia to buy those papers. The president of Rio Previdencia is also getting something to do this. Yeah, and I say, we always need to consider the technical staff. I'm sure someone on the technical staff was saying the deal was wrong. Likewise, remember what happened at Caixa Econômica, which at the time was controlled by the so-called Centro and was even handed over to Arthur Lira, right? They removed 2 directors who refused to buy Banco Master Securities, saying, no, this security isn't good. So since they didn't accept it, and technically they didn't accept it, they were removed. And they put others in to accept it. So let's say it's a scheme that involves everyone. There's always corruption involved, money, and at the very least, everyone is paid to turn a blind eye.
I was about to switch topics, but let's continue with this point. Yeah, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the CVM, would have the role, I believe, of monitoring what's happening in the market. Well, it seems that what happened with Banco Master, they didn't do the job they should have done. Or maybe internally, and here we go back to the point you mentioned, the technical work was completed, but the political decision wasn't made. For those watching, it's notable that there was a long period without a president, and the current president's appointment was even questioned. These technical bodies before, I know that the central bank has already referred to the management of Campos Neto. There were supposed to be problems with some directors, some would be questioned, and others, it seems, might have been somehow, I don't know. Let's wait for the process to go through, because that's a problem in Brazil, right? Avoiding rushed judgments. But the CVM did its job.
In this case, from what I remember about Ambipar, which I personally researched and found, including that 2 internal technical investigations had already found Banco Master's funds may have been used to manipulate Ambipar's stock prices. So theoretically, the technical staff did its job. This Banco Master case is still under. The latest bank scandal is still being investigated, but it must have gone through the technical department. The main issue is that so many instruments and funds are created that agencies and technical staff can't keep up. They often lack the speed and capacity needed. So I don't know.
Do you need more people?
We definitely need more staff at the CVM and central bank, especially in technical roles. Analysts go into funds, examine them, and research the securities. For example, if one had reviewed the fund with Banco Santa Catarina Securities, he would definitely have identified that it was a fraud, right? But did he have enough time? With the amount of work, with the number of funds and instruments they have to supervise, was there enough time for it to reach someone's desk? Because when it comes to those 2 Banco Mais funds, it's clear the CVM took a long time to reach a conclusion. Clearly, there's a shortage of technical staff to analyze everything.
Do traders of these securities earn a commission? For example, to explain to those following us, he keeps issuing Banco Master securities. These securities need to be sold. Probably some of them belong to Banco Master itself, which sells them or uses third parties. Commission, that varies. How does that work?
In fact, I made several criticisms at the beginning, right? I was even threatened with being sued. Yeah, the 2 biggest investment platforms in Brazil distributed this Banco Master security, the CDBs too, right? Yeah, but they profit from it. Yeah, these platforms, because Banco Master didn't have the reach to distribute 40 billion in CDBs. It's a small bank that's located there in Vila Olympia. Yeah, they don't have the capacity for that. So they use the structure that the financial market has. And the structure that the financial market has are the big investment platforms, the big banks. Yeah, they distribute this across Brazil because of their wide reach. So how does it work? They put the CDB there on one of those bank platforms. Then the bank goes and pays their advisors. They say, look, you distribute this and you earn X%. Yeah, and the big criticism I made is that the average CDB commission that the market pays is about 0.5. Banco Master was paying 4%, in other words, eight
Zeros.
times more. So obviously at the end of the line, the advisor who's making a living off commissions to distribute financial assets will say, man, am I going to distribute Bradesco's CDB for 0.5 or Banco Masters for 4%? Obviously, the incentive model is for him to distribute Banco Masters. So just with this detail, right, of someone who's paying way above the market to distribute their paper, it was already a warning sign. Why does he need to pay 8 times more to distribute the same paper?
There's a time when everything falls apart, right? It's the guarantee fund. Up to 250,000 reais is guaranteed by the guarantee fund. And we had the glorious senator from Piauí who wanted to raise it to 1 million, right? It was even nicknamed the Master Amendment and all that. And whoever followed knows the whole story. Now, what draws attention is this. There are moments when that person who bought the paper, the small investor, someone who had 100,000 reais, let's say, saved it and so on, he receives the return that the bank said it would pay. But there will come a time when the whole thing will collapse, because there comes a time when he is no longer able to redeem his investment. When does this usually happen? Because in the case of Banco Master, it seemed like things happened very quickly over time. Last year, because at a certain point he was buying a bank. I mean, how can a bank that was already, to put it more bluntly, going bankrupt, could buy another Banco Regional de Brasilia, BRB, known to many only as Flamengo's jersey sponsor? Many don't realize the bank exists. Yeah, and he was set to buy BRB. And so it becomes a situation that's hard for the public to understand. They say, wow, he was doing all these shady deals, to use an expression from the 1989 presidential campaign. The first time they used that word politically. Yeah, how was it possible for him to do that? I mean, trying to buy a state-owned bank. And this state-owned bank, I remember that a lady, I could be wrong, but she said there was very effective compliance and he was setting a good example regarding the acceptance of Banco Master's proposal. And we saw that, unfortunately, the story was different. How is that?
Again, it's corruption, right? That's definitely corruption, especially because, and you're one of the first to say this, because what was sold to the market was the opposite. That BRB would be buying Banco Master to save the business. They planned to invest 16 billion there, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, they had already injected 16 billion in Banco Master's securities and were going to buy it for 2 billion. In fact, the timeline I put together shows that's exactly what the central bank had told Banco Master at the last minute in December, the last month of Campos Neto's tenure. They had given Banco Master a 3-month deadline to inject 2 billion because they were having solvency and liquidity problems. Coincidentally, when the 3-month deadline ended, BRB appeared saying they'd inject exactly 2 billion. But what they told the market was that BRB would be buying Banco Master. But when you look at the deal, it was the opposite, because BRB was going to inject 2 billion in capital, but they were only going to buy 49% of the common shares, which gives control of the bank. And 51% of the common shares would still stay with Daniel Vorcaro,
who would therefore be the chairman.
Who would be the chairman? In other words, he would continue controlling both BRB and Banco Master, right? So they present these operations to the market in a certain way. How was this possible? It involved politics, right? Just like it involved Rio Previdencia in Rio, it involved BRB in the federal district. It involved other states as well, if I'm not mistaken. In Amapá, there was also the pension fund, right, for public servants in Amapá. So all of this involved politics. There's still a lot for us to find out, right? Because there's still a lot to come out, especially about the parties he used to throw, right? Who was at his parties?